Hi, my name is Jet.AVI, and I'm here to ask the question, how did we get into this mess? It's kind of a vague statement, but anybody that has to pay bills probably understands what I'm talking about. We have unemployment around 20%, state budget cuts, and school budget crisis. It affects everyone. It affects everyone here. So what caused the Great Recession? I intend to prove that irresponsible, unregulated financial institutions caused the economic downturn. I will prove this with two distinct points. First, I will show that the institutions were irresponsible by proving that banks were and are more concerned with their own profits than with the soundness of their dealings. And second, I will show that the unsoundness and non-regulation of these dealings led directly to the economic collapse. First of all, it's important to understand what financial institutions I'm referring to. There are essentially two different types of banks. Commercial banks, which are the kind that most regular people like you and me keep their money in, are subject to government regulations. They pay into federal insurance to make sure that their money is covered, and they're essentially federally covered to be solvent. Investment banks are often referred to as non-deposit banks because they technically aren't in the business of holding money, and they don't accept deposits. They go unregulated. There is no standard for the amount of money they actually keep on hand, and they do not pay into federal insurance. It is this second type of bank that I will attempt to prove caused the meltdown. In 1985, the early days of swap trading, which is essentially a term for a bet in the trading world, which is essentially like someone saying to another party that they bet corn will cost more than $3 in some certain period of time, and the other person says that they bet it will cost less than $3 in a certain period of time. And the investment banks essentially trade not in the bets, but they trade the bets themselves. And according to the book Infectious Greed by Frank Portney, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB, inquired about banks keeping swaps off their balance sheets. That was in 1985. Immediately, with the fear that their newly invented and previously off-the-books trading would be brought to the public attention, many of the largest banks, including Goldman Sachs, Citicorp, Merrill Lynch, and many others, who were usually fierce competitors competing for business with the public, they banded together, which is something that rarely happens, in order to lobby against any new regulations. This in itself shows extreme irresponsibility, but even more shocking is that in 2009, in the midst of our current recession, when it has been proven that these practices caused massive financial instability and led to the taxpayer-funded bailouts, according to the New York Times, these very same banks, and at least the ones that hadn't collapsed in the meantime because a lot of them had, created a lobbying organization, the CDS, a dealers consortium, to lobby against the very same regulations that they lobbied to fight against in the 1980s. So on to my second point. How can we be sure that the unsoundness and non-regulation of these dealings led directly to the economic collapse? We can make this judgment based on the fact that these modern banks employed tactics extremely similar to those employed by trusts in the run-up to the Great Depression. According to the book, The Return of Depression Economics and the Crisis of 2008 by Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, trusts were less regulated and had lower reserve requirements and lower cash reserves than national banks. However, as the economy boomed during the first decade of the 20th century, trusts began speculating in real estate and stock market areas from which national banks were prohibited, which should sound familiar to most of you. Both today and in the early 1900s, these large unregulated institutions, which had over time come to rival the commercial banks in size, relied on the apparent stability of the regulated commercial banks to make their own practices seem sound. Of course, when the investors became aware of unsound practices, people wanted to get their money out of them, and this caused a run on the banks, which is essentially when people go to the banks and try to pull out all their money. And since banks work in a probability-based format where they assume that not everybody is going to go to the bank and pull out their money on the same day, the banks turned out to be insolvent. And this was caused a lot by the fact that they weren't forced to keep a standard amount of capital, and that they weren't federally insured. In the early 1900s, this insolvency led to a series of panics, which is basically a mass run on banks, that led in turn to the Great Depression. In modern history, it led to a massive government bailout and the Great Recession that we deal with today. In conclusion, I hope that you agree with me that irresponsible, unregulated financial institutions cause the economic downturn.
All right, you've given us some background. You clearly state your claim. The signposting on the first point wasn't as clear as the signposting on the second point. You give a lot of explanations of ideas, and I think that that's necessary in order to understand the inferences. What we need is some follow-up on proof about the relationship between the speculation and the consequences. For instance, you mentioned in that second point, you describe what a run is, and you give the explanation. Well, what is it that precipitated this run? What is it that made these investment banks so vulnerable to a run? What actions were taken, or what change in status produced that? Because when people look at this, they're going to say, well, that's what really caused the particular problem. Not the fact that they were unregulated, but the fact that people suddenly panicked about it, and then, that's the source of the problem. So maybe what is it that caused people to run in the first place, whether they're investors? I assume it's got something to do with the real estate issue, but that never gets discussed in this particular point in any detail. It's all about the speculation on investments. It's a little bit of an informative speech on the nature of what the source of the problems is, and I like the contrast between the two different kinds of banks. I thought that was good. You had a couple of good quotes early on. I think you need to develop a little bit more the lack of regulation, and what kinds of regulations, for instance, would have made a difference. What kinds of regulations exist in the commercial banks that don't exist in the investment banks that might have stifled this, prevented this from happening, maybe warded off a run, or would have slowed the run down, or allowed them to get their equilibrium back in some way. I don't get enough of that information. So, like I said, it seems to be descriptive and conclusionary instead of helping us follow the inferences that you're making, and I think that that's a little bit problematic. All right. That appears to be all the speakers that we have scheduled for today.